It's welcome to dive into world building, and we have 3 guests this week, which makes me very excited. And because I've been having a hard time getting people in with the technology. Oh my gosh. Anyway, this week's topic is world building under the radar, and I was kind of sounding out the topic with Che and Morgan the other week, and then the reason I wanted to do this one is because sometimes people just write a story without thinking that they're world building, except that you can't. You're always world building. Every time you're writing any kind of story on a page, you're world building. And one could argue that you're actually world building even when you're not writing a story, but writing a political argument on Facebook or that sort of thing. There are all kinds of hidden things that are associated with a worldview, and they are coming out on the page even when you don't think they are. So I thought we would talk about things that you don't think about that are coming out on the page. Yeah, so world building when you don't think you're world building, or also I was going to say, those kinds of things that if they're not there, and if you haven't thought through them, your world can feel a little flimsy, even though you might not be able to put your finger on what exactly is missing. There are also things where if you haven't thought them through, sometimes they can pop out as being anachronistic or not fitting in the world. And so, yeah. The things that you might not think about but are good to sort of think through so that your world holds together better on the page. So what are those things? Well, measurement. How do you measure distance, for example?
Right, we were talking about that.
Yep.
Or money.
How do you measure time?
Oh God. Yeah, I have a devil of a time naming money. And for some reason,
all the money. That's right.
It always comes up. Like my characters inevitably have to buy something, and I have to come up with what do they call their money.
Yeah.
And so I was sitting there for 10 minutes before, like,
oh my God, 10 minutes. Well, one of my characters runs a shop, right? So they have to be thinking about money. The units didn't come in until later when one of the kids is been told, look, go open the shop, and he goes and looks in the safe so he can get the cash out, and he's looking and he's saying, there's only 10 what do they call these coins?
Yeah, right? XXX placeholder.
Oh, and then you have to say, okay, why do they call it that?
Yeah.
And so I'm there saying, okay, why is it called a dollar? Why do we call something a dollar or a nickel? And it's like, okay, so let's go back into my world and see. I can't really call it those things because that doesn't quite fit. I need something local, and this is it. So yeah, exactly.
I mean, so if you use copper, silver, gold, then you don't actually have to necessarily provide the units, right? On the other hand, who counts gold pieces, right? I mean, right? Like, I mean, I guess in like D&D and Pathfinder and a bunch of different contexts, you find people counting gold pieces, right? But gold pieces weren't a thing. They were crowns, or they were, they had names, and like pieces of 8 were a thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, and pieces of 8 were a thing because you had these big silver coins that were literally made out of silver, so their value was the same if you cut them into 8 pieces as it was if you didn't.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
right?
Where does the
So
gold come from? You need a
where's the
source
gold
of
come
gold.
from, right?
And nickel. I mean, where do you get the nickel for your nickels? And so is there a place that it comes from? Who mines the copper? You know,
Hmm.
yeah, this is under the radar, all the things that you need to think of.
Well, we've
So,
actually spoken on a number of occasions about dive into world building. So I'm going to say, I'm going to point everybody who's watching the video to go back and look at all my episodes about economics, because economics is one of those things where if you don't have it figured out, oh boy, right?
Yeah.
Like, but these are the questions. These are the questions. So, what is the money is connected to where the heck did all this gold come from, which is connected to who the heck mined it out of the ground, right? And how did things like how did the nobility get to be so rich? Why are they rich, right?
yeah,
Because we can easily say, oh yeah, of course the nobility are rich. But then of course it's like, well, but where does their money come from? Right?
Yeah.
Oh, they have money, and they have more money than they could possibly know what to do with, so they can buy all the things. But if we don't know where their money is coming from, it's a problem. I mean, yeah, we can just sort of say, hand waving, oh, but see, of course they have all the money because they are the nobility. But that's a missing piece if you have to go further into exploring the society, right?
Yeah.
And so, for example, in Varin, the nobility are rich because they own all the land.
yeah.
Everything,
How did that happen?
all the land doth belong to me. and so what that does is it ends up taking enormous amounts of whatever's produced on that land and just shoving it into their treasury pretty directly, right? Because there's an automatic tax for using the land, right? I mean, it's not hard to set up, but you have to know it's there, because otherwise it's like, I am creating money for nothing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you've got two different currencies, going back to the money, and I mean,
Absolutely.
you said why quarters are called quarters. We know nickels are called nickels because they've got nickel in them.
Yeah, or at least they did at a certain time. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, for Canadian coins, you've got loonies and toonies. There's a loon on one side, and a toonie I think has a loon on one side, but it's a $2 coin.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Do you have handy, Sally? Is that what you're looking for? I don't. But if you've got what I've got there is a Haran is the base unit of the coin that I came up with. But you can't just walk around with everything in pennies, which is basically that. Where did I
Yeah.
But and they're called there's a Kennedy dollar, right? Why is Kennedy on a coin? And who else's face would you put on a coin?
I think it's a 50-cent piece.
Leaders, or
Yeah.
if it's from a particular place, and you might put a picture of a mountain on it, like the state quarters. But why that particular mountain, and what do you call it?
Right.
And what's why are the reasons that you put? Oh wow, I used copper, nickel, silver, and gold. But then I you name them based on. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
You name them based on the ruler, or the if the highest value coin is going to be named after the highest office in the union.
Well, actually, okay, so you can have that, or you can have in my world there is no paper money, because paper is not really a thing. I mean, it's a thing, but it's expensive enough. It's basically like if the only thing available were rag paper.
It's actually pretty decent.
So it's not like, it's fine. It's just that there's not a ton of it available. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of expensive, so certain people don't use it. So they don't use it for money. Okay.
Mhm.
So they have coins, and then they have flats. And flats are higher denomination. So it's like, imagine if you had a little, very, very thin piece of metal like this big with a denomination stamped on it. And that would be a flat.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided that I would call the money Orsheth, which basically means silver that you carry with you. But it's not made of silver. So, like it's a funny thing because we talk about how, nickels are made of nickel and whatever, but honestly, they used to be made of the things that they are named after, right? Pennies are supposedly copper pennies, but they're mostly made out of zinc, I think, at this point. And they cost more to produce than they are worth, which is why they're phasing them out.
Right.
Ish.
Also,
But anyway,
silly
yeah.
things.
So it's interesting. I mean, like if you go to Japan and you see the 1 yen pieces now, so Japan's an instance of a place where they don't actually have a different word for different denominations, right? You've got 1 yen, you've got 100 yen, you've got 20 yen, you've got, and then the first piece of paper is 1,000 yen, and then they have 10,000 yen paper, right? But there's only one word for it.
Yeah.
So they don't have dollars and cents. They just have yen, and like depends on how many yen, right? So in similarly to that, I suppose you could say, the way that the Orsheth work, right? But yeah. So one Orsheth in I actually have worked out the conversion rate is one Orsheth is about 5%. Morgan's got a great
See that you've only got one word or you've got multiple words for parts of a system.
Yeah.
Why don't we have 100 pennies or 1,000 pennies or why did we break it down?
I don't know. But like in the words for the currency in England were incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
So our system is actually super simple. Like, tuppence and a penny and a crown and
a halfpenny
and a pound and a
and quid.
and quid. Yeah, exactly. So like basically you can have one term or you can have lots of terms. It's just a question of how much time you want to spend making it all work. Like I'm not surprised that in Harry Potter you've got galleons and nuts and sickles, and that you have at least 3 different currency names for the wizarding world because this is England and we have lots of names for currency. Right?
Yeah.
So having 3 is kind of like, okay, that's pretty simple. Yeah. But
what about some of the other things that you do without noticing?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about like distance and like, so for example, very often we will try to set the height of people, right? We'll try to talk about how tall somebody is. How do we talk about that, right? Because we will often say, well, this person's 5'6". That would be me. Or, oh, this guy was huge. He had to be at least 6 foot, right? But feet and inches are very particular, right? And in fact, yeah. So like In Australia, they use feet and inches for height, but they use kilograms for weight. We use pound, right? So feet and inches, and we use pounds. But in Australia, they use feet and inches for height, but they use kilograms or stone for weight. And as far as I know, in England, they use centimeters for height, in kilograms or stone for weight. Right? And so just committing to a measurement of height and weight for people, because you want to be able to describe your people in a way that they'll be able to grasp how big they are. Committing to a measurement like that is actually committing to something very specific, right? And you either have to say, well, this is a translation, right? This is a translation of the thing that they use in their world language, whatever, right? Because it's a lot of work to invent an entirely new measurement system.
Yeah.
Right? And it's also going to stick out like a sore thumb. So, because whenever you use a word that's not an English word, you have to teach it to people. And you have to ask yourself, is it worth teaching it to people? And is it worth the amount of perceived distance between me and my reader that's going to occur if I have to teach them a new word? Right?
Yeah.
So often what you'll find is science fiction will tend to go metric, because there's a perception that that's more modern, right? Fantasy will often stick with either our current measurement style, or they will, pick something like leagues, which is a little more archaic, right?
Yeah. I think archaic anything shows up in fantasy a lot because it's, ancient-y times.
I mean, I use.
But then you still have to look up. Like, I don't know what a league is. I have to go look that up.
Well, what's funny is that if you really this is what I always say. Okay, so let's talk about another measurement: temperature. Right. So
it's hot.
if I'm
it's cold
in Australia and everybody is measuring temperature in Celsius, and there's no point. Here's what I have learned. There is no point in trying to figure out what exactly it means within your system. Right?
Right.
Because what you want to know is what it's going to feel like outside. So you kind of have to set, okay, let's find some specific measurements inside this system and decide what that means. So 30 degrees is quite hot. 40 degrees, oh my God, hot, right? 20 degrees, a nice day. 10 degrees, wow, it's chilly. 0 degrees, freezing, right? So if you can form this approximative understanding of what the number means, then you don't actually need to convert from Fahrenheit to Celsius all the time, and you don't need to convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit all the time, right? So that was what I decided to do after a while, after I had been interacting with Australia for a while, right? In the same way, do we really need to know how long a league is? Or as Sally notes, the fathoms? Right? Do we really need to know? Well, maybe we don't, right? But we have to consider how the people think about those measurements, right? And I have an advantage, which is that my underground world is underground, and the temperature is always basically the same.
Yeah. So there's no weather reports. You don't need to.
I don't have to say what the temperature is because, you know, I mean, there's no point in measuring it most of the time, so people don't actually have a sense of temperature except in as much like cooking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so far, I don't have a lot of people cooking, so I haven't had to worry about it. Yeah.
Actually, I have a lot of people cooking. That's food turns up in a lot of my places. But
Yeah.
Me
we
too.
don't talk about degrees because we didn't get that specific in recipes. Sort of, is the oven the right temperature?
See, I
My oven
actually
is
did
that
use
way,
degrees.
boss.
Yeah. I was very specific. In Tea Times 3 there was a candy making scene.
Yeah.
You have to be really specific in candy making.
Yeah.
Um, so I used like I stole the recipe off of like Alton Brown. It's Alton Brown's marshmallow recipe.
Yeah. So sometimes you have to be really specific, so you have to watch out for that, right? Yeah. And how much in a way it's about how much effort do you have to spend to do the translation to make it understandable. Now, like what sometimes you don't have to. So I've been reading the ancillary books to my daughter. Okay? And one of the things that's notable about the ancillary books is they don't really talk about height in measurement.
Mhm.
They just don't, right?
Yeah.
And they do talk about distance, and I think it's in kilometers, but I think, in fact, that they spend mostly, and Lecky measures things in time elapsed. Okay? So it'll take 3 days, you know, it'll take 3 days for the shuttle to arrive after it's come out of the gate kind of thing, right? So I don't want to neglect the topic of food, which we were just on, but I think time measurement is another thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, in fact, you want most of these things not to be noticeable, right? You don't want to have to spend lots of time on them. Oh, yes, days of the week.
Oh my god, I know. I'm always sort of torn between like, do I just use Saturday, Sunday, Monday, etc., or do I like, oh, I'm gonna rename the days of the week, or do I just cop out and call it the weekend? You know.
Yeah. Like, so for example, are we gonna reinvent the wheel? Do we need to?
Yeah.
I actually reinvented the entire time system.
Mhm.
But I tried to keep it under the radar in Varin. So like a second, I was like, how did they figure out what a second was? Okay. And I decided that they are long ago, some of the people that are the early ancestors of the Varni were astronomers. Okay? Trust me, it does make sense in the end. 2,000 years ago, they were astronomers, and they were able to detect a wobble in one of the stars they were looking at. And they were like, ooh, that would be cool to measure time with, because there's this very predictable wobble in this celestial body, right? And so that was how they defined a second. But then I decided, well, actually, they had to use binary stuff. So in Varin, you might not know this, but a minute is 64 seconds.
Okay. So
And an hour is 64 minutes. And there are actually 22 hours in a day. But it's not supposed to be that noticeable, right?
Yeah.
What you'll find is that people will tend to measure things in like 4 minutes instead of 5 minutes, right? Or they'll say, you know, it happened 16 minutes ago instead of 15 minutes ago,
Right.
right? And so what it does is, and I think it's an interesting example of something that, you know, that involved a lot of work for me, but shouldn't be very obvious when you're reading, because that would just obstruct your enjoyment of the story, right? So what will end up happening is people will use odd measurements of time, like, right? But they will not, you know, I don't spend a lot of time going, you know, well, it's 11:63, right? Because I think that would just confuse people. So I will say, well, meet me at 12:30, or, you know, meet me at 8:30, and there are these approximative evening versus morning things. But I did a ton of work on the time system, and so morning is called forenoon, and afternoon is called afternoon. But noon is 11 o'clock. Right? So like, I have to be very careful about the names that I give to things, so that the re-derivation of everything does not become an obstruction.
They don't have to see the building, the infrastructure. You don't have to see it.
Right.
It's really helpful if
And
you're
so
writing.
what I decided in terms of the days of the week was that there is a religion, right? Because a lot of our days of the week are derived from religion, right? Like Thor is Thursday, and Tyr is Tuesday, and those are from the Norse religion. Anyway, so I decided that these astronomers, again, the stargazers, they could see the planets, and so they named the days of the week after the planets, who were also their gods. Okay? They didn't count the one they were standing on. And in fact, by some interesting coincidence, there were 7 planets
Yeah,
that they recognized, right? Because you know what? It's just convenient that way.
Yeah.
But so each one of the gods has a different identity, right? And so there's Mai and Plis and Bess and Trigus and Hela, and then Siren and Ain. And Siren and Ain are the lovers. And conveniently, 2 days of the week are dedicated to lovers.
The weekend.
And that's the weekend.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
So basically, part of what makes Varan is that it works a lot of the way that you expect, because it's supposed to feel familiar. It's supposed to feel like you live there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, these are, you know, some people might term this convenient coincidence, but part of the whole point of the Varan world is to feel like everything in it is so familiar, even though it's completely different. So there's a lot of stuff that I've completely re-derived so that I can end up in roughly the same place, but all the consequences are slightly different. And so coming up with the 7 days in the week and the reason for weekends was kind of fun, right? Yeah.
Do you think there's like, is there a certain point where just using like our American analogs just seems lazy, or is it like that's fine, even though it's a fantasy, to not reinvent everything? Like, I mean, do you feel like there's a certain line where,
well, I think
like,
in a
it could have
way,
been better?
a lot of fantasy does seem, I mean, so I think it depends on what the underpinnings of your fantasy are, right? When you're working in when you're working in a fantasy world that is derived off of Europe, using European measurements is not noticeable, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right? I mean, basically, it makes sense to use the cultural underpinnings of whatever the background source world is that you've chosen, right? So it would make sense if you were taking your fantasy and putting it in another place, say Japan or say South Africa, to try to think about what kinds of measurements and what kinds of money, et cetera, were associated with this period of time that is most directly influencing your fantasy world, right? Exactly. Using measurements used in the Roman Empire in a fantasy world based on the Roman Empire. It makes sense. So, yay, sesterces.
Yeah.
Because for the most part, and here's a really important point, for the most part, we want these things not to be noticeable, right? I mean, because it's so much work to try to explain them all. So unless it's directly relevant to plot, I don't see any reason that I should worry about how many minutes there are in an hour, right?
Yeah.
When do you get?
It's 2 minutes to 11, right?
Yeah.
And nobody has to know that it's 62 minutes after 10.
Right. He's late.
He's late.
Wow. He's already here.
Because we don't. We actually filter things more through our judgment than we do through their measurements. So, yeah. And in fact, that is such a huge tool when you're not working in the real world.
There is a really good book that I
focus on judgment rather than measurement.
Yeah, where the character is still not entirely sure in measurement how tall the character is, but I know when he goes into, the trailer that they're using for, on-site vaccinations, bring your kid or your dog to our trailer, and instead of having to haul him off to the doctor, he goes in and he's bent over. So I know he's too tall. I know he's tall.
Yeah.
And I have a sense of how big the trailers are because I've, you see them. They're not mobile homes. They're trailers. So he's a big guy, but you don't know if he's 6'2" or 6'6" or and it doesn't really matter unless and then if there are in other circumstances where it is where the comparison is, oh wow, he was actually 6 inches taller than she was, and that made things a little awkward. He's always getting a crick in his neck if he had to talk to her.
Yeah, right. But you can also say, she only came up to my shoulder, or that kind of thing. I do run into it, because, for example, I just ended up using feet and inches in height measurement in a couple of places just because I got there and I was like, I just need to be able to say 6 foot tall.
Yeah.
And luckily what I lean on in those cases is the idea of translation. Really, because Varin is a science fiction world, not a fantasy world. And so this is why I end up rederiving lots of things, in part, because I really want it to feel like a science fiction world where you can have real precision with things when you need it. But there are some, so basically, one of the things that I kind of hold on to when I'm feeling frustrated because I don't want to rederive every last thing, and confuse readers and make them do extra work, right? Is that I say, well, this is Varin. Nobody's speaking English here. Everybody's speaking Varin, the language, and it's okay. I can just translate it into English in a way that my readers will understand. and so that way, if I have feet and inches, well, that's okay, because I just need to be able to express that to English speakers in a way that's convenient. So, you know. Yep. I think we lost Che.
No.
You there, Che?
No.
Where are you, Che?
I'm here. I had to set the computer down for a minute.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Is that a kid
So
singing?
let's see, what else? What else? Okay, so you had mentioned food,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and I think food is worth spending a couple minutes on because we have to know where the food comes from and how it gets to where it goes, right? I mean, there are a lot of yes, you can import an entire economic system, trade system, wholesale, right? We do need to make sure that yes, absolutely, we need to have a whole hangout on this because it's a huge topic, huge. But so I will write that down, food, and I will put that in our list of topics for the future. But yeah, it's important to know where the food comes from and also what the climate is, because having food that doesn't match the climate, yeah.
It has to be imported.
Right, I mean,
somehow. Or it's like it's a special thing you only get once in a while. Or saying like, I think it's easier in like modern and futuristic things that you can have like all these exotic things from all over because there's a good transport system.
right.
But fantasy, it was more like area specific, you know.
Well, it depends, obviously, on what your transport system is, which is another thing.
Yeah. You know, if you got to get the food to market on a horse cart before it spoils, you know, there's a certain distance limit to how far certain products are going to go if they're perishable.
Yep.
You know, grains and things can go relatively easily. And then food is dependent on climate.
Yep. So you have to think through, well, who's growing it? Where are they growing it? What's the weather like? What are they likely to be able to grow? I mean, if you think about what the food landscape looked like in Europe before people made contact and reliable contact with the East, you know, where were the spices coming from? What were they doing? You know, and I'm sure that that this changes over time. Like, you know, when you've got Roman roads and you can carry things along Roman roads, then you can pretty much get something from one end of the empire to the other, right? So you might have a more diverse type of food life at that point. And then, of course, the empire falls and the roads start going to disrepair, and all of a sudden you can't eat the same things that you used to, right? Yeah. History of food access, right?
Well, then there's also like for your fantasy or your sci-fi, do you want to include invented products? You know, like alien delicacies from another planet, or like, you know, some magical fruits that, you know, don't have a real world analogy.
Or a food that, and I guess this actually belongs in food, a food that is a familiar food, and you say, oh, but I replaced the ginger with, you know, some other thing that you can only get from a distant country or a distant planet. Or
yeah.
or some place that is only accessible because of changes in politics or whatever.
There's also something that is worth pointing out, which is that whole thing about if it's a rabbit, call it a rabbit.
Yes.
And this is an interesting question because I don't always agree with it. The question is, what purpose is it serving? What role is it playing in the system, right? So, if you're talking about rabbits, okay, so it's a small animal, it's a rodent, and and it does certain things like multiply and eat lots of vegetables, right?
Actually, you could use that for measurements because everybody knows that about rabbits, right? So if you've got an invented creature or a new creature, you can look at it and say, that's about the same size as rabbit, but it eats so much more. Or it moves even faster than a rabbit.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, now I know I have a sense of what that creature is like. But that's
right.
That's measurements, and yeah.
Well, comparing. So if you have a person who is a human being and knows what a rabbit is, and then you have another creature that fills much of the same role, but it has some differences, that's a very useful way of talking about it. It's like a rabbit, except, right?
Yeah.
But if you're in an entirely secondary world and there is no such thing as a rabbit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or there is, because you can import rabbits to a secondary world, no problem, right? Mm-hmm. or horses or whatever it is, and do you want to then name them all differently? Yes, it's a lot of work. Yes, it makes it for a very alien feeling, right? The more alien terms you use, the more estranged your reader feels from the narrative. So, do you use a rough translation, which is often helpful? Do you not? Right? It's a tricky question.
I kind of like the mix and match approach, where you have like a bunch of things that are just like cows and sheep, and then you have like throw in a couple of like special invented animals.
Yeah.
I've seen that a lot. And same with like food, you have like the majority will be like this, but then there's like one or two special things that point out that it's not, that you're not in Kansas anymore.
What I think, honestly, in many ways, one of the things that is useful to do, if you don't want to alienate a reader and you still want to use an alien term, is you have to support the alien term in context, right? You at least have to associate that name with a particular feature of whatever it is that that you're working with, right? And so, like, gosh, there's a ton of examples from my Cold Words world that I mean, because I don't like to use. I got taken to task once for using a translated term. I was like, I said that I had the majesty saying that humans were like grouse, and it was hilarious because I got some guy commented like, "Oh my gosh, grouse is like an earth bird, and what is she doing? Oh my god, she obviously has no idea what she's doing." Well, it's dude.
Chill.
It was a toss-off line, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't having to spend extra time, right? Because what the function of that comment was to say, so what? They're like a bird. What, whatever. And you couldn't put an alien word in that spot because it wouldn't mean anything, right? This was a disparaging comment by Majesty about humans and the fact that they could fly, right? Oh my gosh, humans are so cool, they can fly. What? They're like grouse? Right? And if I tried to use an alien term, there would be no disparaging implication, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Because you'd have to explain it. There'd have to be
exactly, and there was no, you couldn't explain it. There was no room to explain it there. So I mean, because you had to have this thing where he was like, yeah, whatever, you know, and moving on. So these are the kinds of choices that you make in this kind of stuff, right? So that was it was a translation decision, right? I'm like, okay, so this is like the bird on this planet that is the reasonable equivalent of a grouse. Great. You know, my kitties are like freaking out over here. Anyway, yeah, so yeah. Anyway, yeah, I have no idea. But I do have a line later in the so Morgan's asking in the chat bar if this person would have had a problem if I had said humans breed like rabbits. Well, I didn't actually say that. No. But I do have a line in the story that is roughly the same, actually. So it's
really?
Let's see. How do we know if humans will fly alone like Harihi or like Rowell to darken the sky? Same story, different context, right?
Right.
Using the alien words, but with a context that allows you to go, oh, okay, right?
Yeah.
Like X, darken the sky like Y, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, so it was doing basically what you were describing, but not using rabbits as a comparison.
Right, not using a...
Yeah.
Because actually, the common metaphor for humans in this world is that they're like birds.
Right.
Which is odd, and I actually never put that together until this moment. But like all the metaphors for humans in this world are that they are like birds. It's kind of funny.
Things your brain does.
Your brain does. Yeah. And that was, Tay, you're saying subconscious world building hangout. I don't know how we talk about that.
I know.
But you do things. No, you do things in your subconscious. Your brain is operating under your own radar. I don't know how to talk about them, right?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I think maybe we should bring it up for a topic because I think I might have a useful way to talk about that.
I personally do very little world building before I start writing, and I just sort of make things up as I go, and I'm not sure that's always the best approach.
Do some backfilling.
I have certain defaults that I just like, that I kind of keep using. So I think there's sort of like, I don't know, like use me as a cautionary example like I don't know, maybe put some thought into things before you start. But I have sort of subconsciously put things together in interesting ways a few times.
Yeah.
Or like as I've written, come up with interesting solutions to things. Even in like my Carmine werewolf novel, I had like I was writing along and I was just making things up, and I needed something about like, well, if the police use werewolves, also to help solve crimes, then I put in this thing where there's like the idea of a scent conviction, where if you can You know, if your werewolf policeman comes in and can smell, you know, one of the suspects in the area, then yeah, you've got, you know, you can use that, so, you know, it's evidence, right? But there are limits to like the radius. And then I also had the idea where the gangs have what they call scrubbers who come in and spray down crime areas with chemicals to ruin the scent conviction. And I was just making that up completely on the fly. You know, so like I said, once in a while, good things happen that way.
Well, what's funny
I
is,
like
it's really great stuff, Jay. But
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's relevant for our topic here is that everything in a world is interconnected, right?
Yeah.
And so if you change one thing, it's going to have a domino effect on all kinds of other stuff. And so, you know, change one thing, you'll start to discover other things.
Yeah.
So if you actually want things, this is why it's good to put conscious thought into it sometimes, because suddenly you'll find, oh, wait, this thing changed and I wasn't ready, or, you know. But on the other hand, you don't have to put the conscious thought in your first draft, right?
Mm-hmm.
Write the story, because the story is the core of it, and the story is what you want.
Mm-hmm.
And then later go back and go, okay, let's iron out some of these things I haven't quite figured out. Like, what is the contour? Like, you know, like, it's almost like you're watching a character walk along and their head is bobbing up and down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh, this person's head is bobbing up and down, so I gotta see how uneven the ground is in this area, right? To find the causes for the effects that you've already got in the story. It's a useful exercise to do.
Yeah.
Because if you have inconsistency, then there can be a problem. But depending on how you put it together, there may not be any glaring inconsistencies. So yay, right? Yeah. Well, we are out of time.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
As usual, things start taking off right at the end. Like, oh, we gotta go talk about this. But that's okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have food and subconscious world building on our list for topics for future hangouts, and I'm going to put them into my list so I don't forget them, because I forget things. I write them down in my notes, because if I don't write them down, I'm all, oh, what did we say we were going to talk about? Anyway,
I know that.
so next week is going to be food. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Food
Let's
is
do
good.
food, because I don't like to do the same topic 2 weeks in a row. And subconscious world building, while I think it's really fascinating, is similar enough to this week's topic that I think we should probably put it off by a couple weeks. I am arranging for a guest for April, but I don't have it all pinned down yet. So when I have that, I will let you know. I have some really cool people coming up, so yay. Anyway.
Cool.
I really enjoyed last week. It was neat to meet
Fabio was
you.
so cool. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Well, anyway,
Oh my god, yes.
I just got the report up too, so go check that out. Next week will be Wednesday at 10, talking about food. Yippee! And I will stop the broadcast. Thanks for being here.